I want to talk about 1 Timothy 2:12. It is the primary verse used in Scripture to restrict women from teaching men or being in places of authority over men. And it's an important verse because it is actually the only verse in the entire Bible, New Testament or Old Testament, that explicitly restricts women from these roles. This is what 1 Timothy 2:12 says. But I do not allow a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet. Reading this verse in the English translation, it does seem pretty clear that women are restricted from teaching men or being in places of authority over men. But when you dig into the Greek and you look at the Greek words and what's going on in this verse, that translation is actually not so clear. Priscilla was a woman in the New Testament who we are told taught a man. In Acts 18:26, it says that Priscilla, along with Aquila, her husband, took Apollos, who was a man, aside and explained the way of God more accurately to him. And in this passage, Priscilla is listed first. When someone is listed first in the Bible, it actually means that they are the more prominent one. So in this case, Priscilla would be the more prominent teacher. And in 4 of the 6 places where Priscilla and Aquila are listed together in Scripture, Priscilla's name is listed first. So if Priscilla was allowed to teach a man, and she was actually commended for this, she was not condemned, then is Scripture really restricting women from ever teaching men? Well, I want to dig into 1 Timothy 2:12 and see if we can discover, looking at some things in the Greek, what this verse might be saying, and if it really is restricting women from teaching and being in places of leadership over men. So the first thing I want to talk about in the Greek is the word that's translated to exercise authority, and that is the Greek word authentine. Authentine is a unique word because this is the only place in all of Scripture that this word is used. So when translators want to determine the meaning of a word, if it's not a common word with a known meaning, they look at other places used in Scripture, which does not work for authentine. And so then they go to other places where it's used in the literature of the time. And interestingly enough, authentine is used just a handful of times within a 100-year time period when this is written. Some of the earliest uses of authentine in the Greek were for murder of oneself or someone else. And then closer to the time period where this was written, it was still used for murder, also for perpetrator of a crime or acts of violence. From my understanding, it was 300 to 400 years later that authentine was used in the positive way as to exercise authority. If authentine does not mean something positive, then the verse actually takes on a very different meaning. So some earlier translations, like the King James Version, translates authentine as to usurp authority, and some translations say to dominate, which would make sense looking at the meaning of authentine from that time period. However, there are some issues with that translation, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute. If Paul were really restricting women from ever being in authority over men, then it seems really strange that he would not have used just the usual Greek word for authority, which is exousia. Exousia is used over 100 times in the New Testament, and Paul actually uses it 20 times in his writings. And yet in this verse, he picks this obscure word, authentine. Thankfully, there's something else in this verse in the Greek that will give us a clue to the meaning of authentine. And that is the connecting word or in this verse, to teach or exercise authority. This Greek word translated or into English is used in very specific ways in Greek. I'm going to talk about the 3 main ways, which would be to link 2 things together, to join 2 things in a progression, or to define a purpose or a goal. The first way is to link 2 things together. And when or is used to link 2 things together, it is either going to link 2 things that are positive or 2 things that are negative. It never links a positive and a negative together. So that's why the King James Version would not work to teach or to usurp authority, because teaching is a positive thing and usurping authority is a negative thing. I don't think this meaning of or can be the correct use of this word in this verse and the correct meaning because of that. So the second way that or is used is to join 2 things in a progression. So that would be joining 2 things from a more general to the more specific. In this verse, if that were the case, Paul would have listed exercise authority first and then teaching second, because exercise authority would be a little bit more of a broader term, and then to teach would be kind of a subcategory or an example of what kind of authority he's referring to. So this can't be the meaning of or in this verse either. The third and last way that or can be used that I want to talk about is to define a purpose or a goal. So in this case, it would be if authentine is translated in this negative way as to dominate, it would be, I do not allow a woman to teach in order to dominate a man or to teach with the goal of mastering a man. And this actually does make sense with this verse, right? Because Paul could be referring to a specific type of teaching or a certain type of activity that women may have been doing at Ephesus. Because in Ephesus at that time, there was a lot of false teaching happening. And roughly 50% of the letter of 1 Timothy deals with false teaching. And so it actually would make sense that Paul may be referring to maybe a woman that Timothy knows that is engaging in false teaching. There are some verses around this verse that would actually lead us to that conclusion, but I'm not going to get into all of that in this video, hopefully in a future video. So there's one more thing I want to talk about that I think is helpful, and that is how Paul begins this verse. He starts by saying, I do not allow. And that phrase in the Greek is rarely used for a universal command, a command for all time. It's usually just used for a specific situation, and Paul never uses this phrase for a universal command, but only for specific situations. So it seems really unlikely that Paul is giving us this universal command for all time that women can never be in these specific roles with men, especially because Paul is writing this to Timothy after he's known and worked with Timothy for over 15 years. And this is actually one of the last letters Paul writes. So if he's giving us this command, it seems really strange that he is giving it at this time and using this really obscure word, authentine. And so I don't believe this one verse should be used to restrict women who have a teaching gift and leadership abilities for ministering to men that would advance the gospel of Jesus Christ.